entertainment for the evening. So, Bill told me he was very grateful for me filling in for Dr. Sokovich, whose plane was canceled and she can't make it. And so you were supposed to hear from Dr. Sokovich, but instead you get the accidental keynote speaker. And I will say, for those of you from the University of Rochester who may have heard me give this talk at the University of Rochester, I was asked to give a talk about my career in clinical trials. And I called it the accidental trialist, or how did I get here, is sort of the bottom line. But Will said he was grateful. I told him to save that until I finished and see if he's still grateful by the end of it. But so I already introduced myself, and I am at Indiana University. I have been there 3 years as of October. And so I'm just going to start out by saying, why did I pick that name? I don't have any disclosure. So The Accidental Tourist is a great book if you haven't read it. But this book, and really Ann Tyler is a wonderful author. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. And this book actually got turned into a movie. And the important thing about this movie is that it was directed by Larry Kasdan, who you say, okay, so why do I care about that? Well, he was very important because he went to my high school. Not at the same time as we were talking about, Dr. Quigg and I were talking about, age is relative, but Larry Kasdan was older than me. But so I've always had a fondness for this particular
and then the University of Michigan.
I'm sorry?
And then the University of Michigan.
Yes, and then the University of Michigan, and also he, directed Star Wars movies, which if you haven't learned that about me yet, we can talk. So I just started out by talking a little bit about what was my first clinical trial, and I'm just going to take you through each of my clinical trials, sort of pivotal experiences, and what lessons I learned from them. So I was in college. I went to Oberlin. We had to do an honors project to graduate, and I had this study where I was looking at these bugs that would develop hemoglobin underwater when the oxygen content was really low, and I was like, this is really boring. I don't really want to do this. And then my buddy, who was really interested in exercise, we were on the cross-country team together, and he said, hey, look what I found. And we found like something to measure VO2 max. It was like an old machine with like mercury in it and all this other stuff. And so we did all this stuff on the treadmill and measured each other. And we said, we should do a project with this. So we said, okay, well, people were doing all these exercise trials, and we said we could just copy these trials because they're all in men, and let's do them in women because nobody was doing trials in women. So we did an exercise trial in college-age women. We had these inclusion criteria. It had to be female. It had to do no regular exercise. And the only exclusion criteria was if they couldn't walk, right? And then we put them in this program, and then we measured, we did outcome measures that were percent body fat before and after, VO2 max before and after, and then what was their health perception and mood. And we completed the study, and we had, I think, 15 people in it, because isn't that the number you always pick? I think we had 15 people in it. And what I learned from it was that recruiting people into a trial is a lot of work, and that my research partner and I had to play all the roles. Like, we had to do everything. There was no one to help us, and so it's nice to have a research coordinator, which I didn't know anything about at that time, and that women were actually interested in being involved in research, and that was an important lesson to me. And also that there were no exercise trials published, and then we should have followed up on this because we never published it, and years later somebody did almost the same thing and published it, and yeah, so I missed out on my first publication because I just wrote up my honors thesis and then went on my way. I still have a copy of it, but didn't help me. So my second clinical trial was in medical school, and we did a pilot trial looking at insulin levels in women who were middle-aged, 20 to 40 years old. We thought that was middle-aged, but we looked at the such an exercise with and without a high carb. So I was working, I partnered, this was the other thing I learned is that it's good to partner. I partnered with a nutritionist who was getting her PhD, and she was wanting to look at these questions as well, and needed someone who could go to the lab and measure the insulin levels in the blood and sort of run the whole study. And I also knew about, VO2 max. Now we had like a fancier machine and a treadmill, and that worked out really well. And they had 2 visits to the exercise physiology lab that was separated by 1 to 4 weeks. We had trouble recruiting for this trial as well a little bit. I recruited my mom, who didn't really enjoy the part where we were checking percent body fat. At that point, to do that, you had to put them into a water tank to measure percent. My mom can't swim, and but she did it. She's what?
A Bacta tank.
Yeah, Bacta tank would have been better, but she did it. And I learned this, that I still really enjoy research, including especially the part of working with people, as well as the part in the laboratory, and that women were still interested in research, amazingly enough. And actually my mentors were both women. One was an exercise physiologist and one an endocrinologist. And so that was kind of fun because we had an all-female team back in the days when there were not that many women in medicine. And then I also learned not to recruit my mother into any studies because they never went up and down. And then the clinical research can be viewed more negatively than basic science research. And why I say that is because part of what we did is we submitted this for an award. There was something called the Van Leer Award at West Virginia University, where I went to medical school, and the comments that I got back was, this was a good study, but it's too clinical. So I came in second. I might have come in second anyway, but that kind of stuck with me. And maybe basic science research was a little over-respected and clinical research was a little under-respected. And then we should have followed up on this because we had some pretty cool results. But I went on and I did my residency, and we did a retrospective chart review for Lambert-Eaton with neoplasms. We used 3 U.S. neuromuscular centers, so we partnered, again, 3 different sites, looking at retrospective data for this rare disease. We found exactly what other people had found in the past in smaller studies, but we confirmed it by looking at a larger number of patients. And this was my first national presentation of any kind of clinical research, even though it was chart review. And I went to the AANEM, which at that time was the AAE, it might have been the AAEE, then it became the AAEM, and then the AANEM. But anyway, as I was going to present this research, one of the fellows said to me, well, don't worry, there won't be anybody really important at that meeting, right? It's just the AANEM. So I presented this study on Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and afterwards asked lots of questions, and then I stepped down from the podium, and this man walked up and he said, that was a great presentation. I'm Dr. Lambert. So what did I learn? Always present your data as if the world leaders on your topic will be in the room. It was kind of like, I was so glad. I had no idea he was in the audience because I probably wouldn't have been able to talk. And then being humble helps open doors to learning. I sat down then and talked to him a lot about the disease and path forward. So I then went on to be, I spent a couple of years in private practice for family reasons. Then I went on to be faculty at West Virginia University. And so at that point was when I started thinking, there's not enough clinical research in our department, and I'm very interested in neuromuscular diseases. And went up to, at that point I wasn't afraid to walk up to leaders if I could present about Lambert-Eaton in front of Dr. Ed Lambert. I could probably walk up to anybody, and I walked up to Bob Miller, who was running the Western ALS group before it became the Western ALS, and they were doing a large database. And so I asked if we could be involved, and he said, well, we're only using Western sites. And I said, well, I'm in West Virginia. And so I was persistent enough that he allowed me to be involved in this. And I learned a lot about natural history studies from this. And so this was really a great experience. And then I became part of the larger ALS clinical trials group. There was an important trial an important study that we did looking at CNTF in patients with ALS, which was a quote-unquote failed trial. I'm not supposed to say that, it was a negative trial. But one of the things that we learned was that you still needed a placebo arm, even in such a terrible disease, because the natural history changed over the time that we were doing the study, which is probably a familiar story, as people became more aware of the disease and started to use practice parameters to take better care of these patients. So, I also got involved. I was very interested in other types of clinical trials, still interested in exercise, and partnered with the exercise physiologist to look at, can you help patients with Charcot-Marie Tooth disease by having them do exercise, and also giving them creatine, and that was a really interesting experience to try to look at. We had to figure out how we would get placebo for the creatine and how to do the exercise trial itself. It was a lot of fun. And we also had an external advisor, Mark Ternopolsky, who was from Canada, and is from Canada, London, Ontario, and he was a great advisor on how to do clinical trials as well. So I also got involved in the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, where I started networking more. It's actually where I got to be friends with Robin Conway, who continues to be my friend, and despite everything that I've done to her, no, I'm kidding. And if there's something I can stress here, it would be that networking is important. And the lessons learned from this first phase was, you should not be afraid to ask to be a part of a group that you're interested in. A lot of times people think that, well, I'm too junior and maybe they don't want me. And actually the diversity of ideas and diversity that you bring as a more junior faculty to groups that are established are really important. So when we talk about diversity, one of the things that we have to remember is that having young and old people in a network or in a research group really does help to make the research better. I also learned that you have to think about whether or not a placebo is important, even in a disease where people die quickly. And then I also learned that I still love exercise studies. So I got to a point where I couldn't really go any farther where I was. There wasn't anybody to really mentor me in clinical trials. And so I was looking to leave and was looking for another job, and decided that I might want to be a program director at NINDS. Actually, Robin was there and suggested that I look at the job, and I did. And almost took it, and then my mother got really sick and I needed to stay in West Virginia. So they contracted with me, and I did part-time clinical work at West Virginia and part-time as a program director. It was amazing. It was totally unique. John Marler, who was my boss then, he's still the best boss I ever had. And I partnered with so many people outside of NINDS that were at multiple stages of their research, multiple stages in their career. I learned a ton about study design. That's where I learned, so I had the background experience of being a site investigator and doing, learning about clinical trials and maybe designing some small clinical trials myself, but then that's where it really, I just learned so much. I got to be on the NIAMS Muscular Dystrophy Coordinating Committee and hear about, groundbreaking basic science research that was going to get translated into clinical research, and a lot about how multi-center trials can go well and how they can go badly. And so during this time, I got involved with, and actually, since this was a Rochester talk that I had prepared, and I haven't morphed it very much other than the title page. A lot of these are talks that relate to Rochester, so Birch Griggs was leading this trial on Duchenne muscular dystrophy up here, and I got to help with that. I got to be part of the Common Data Elements group. I still I still co-chair that, the neuromuscular Common Data Elements, so that has been something that I've been very grateful to learn more and more about. And then actually Robin and several of us wrote a paper called Adding More Muscle and Nerve to Clinical Trials, which was, I think, one of the most clever titles ever for a paper, don't you agree? But part of it was looking at the landscape and seeing that there were not very many clinical trials. This trial, the Warsef trial, taught me so much about struggling through. There were so many things that happened during this trial that were unexpected and not really in the control of the trialist. And it took so long that eventually some of the treatments for stroke had moved on. But I learned a lot about this trial and when you may need to say it's time to end something, even if you haven't reached the point that you originally said you wanted to for trials. And then the other thing that I learned is that when the government wants to move fast on a trial, they can move fast, right? So there was that study where they gave mice lithium, mouse models of ALS lithium. If I'm telling this story wrong, Robin, you can correct me. But they gave them lithium, and mice got so much better. And then they also just gave it to a couple of people and said that they also their disease stabilized. And so everybody in the ALS community wanted to, and this paper was published, and everybody in the ALS community wanted lithium, right? And the question was, you could get it very easily, right? So how are we going to study this? We would never have the answer. And so partnering with, actually I think Merit Sokovich, yeah. Partnering with Merit Sokovich and the Niels group, NINDS designed a very quick study to look at the safety and efficacy. This study, I think, did it reach futility, right?
Yeah. The DSMB, which I was on, shut it down for.
Right, the DSMB, which Chris was on. See how all this networking is so important, all these people that you know. And that was really fascinating to me, that when something really needed to be answered quickly, everybody pulled together. I mean, it was really impressive how quickly it was pulled together. So what did I learn? NIH is super complex. Do you agree with that, Adam? NIH is very complex, and you should rely on your program officer heavily to help guide you through that. Because that's the key role. One of the key roles of the program officer is to really be helpful to the researchers to try to help you make your way through your clinical trials. And but I also learned at NIH that clinical research sometimes took a back seat to basic science research. Would you agree with that? You don't have to, Adam, but you're nodding your head yes. So I'm going to say. Yeah, he takes the fifth. And that clinical trial design is not always straightforward. And also common data elements. So one of the things that happened when we started the common data elements was lots of fighting. I don't think that was before Zoom. I don't think I ever heard so many people yelling at each other on the phone on a conference call. I was sort of like, whoa, what is happening here? People hold really hard onto their beliefs about common data elements and what they should be. So that was also important. And that being a part of NINDS and even on some DSMBs later, the voice of the patient and patient advocates in clinical research is highly valuable. So this need to know the answer about lithium was really important. And then the biggest lesson I learned is you should never design a clinical trial without a biostatistician working with you from the start. And I do remember at one point some clinical trial folks wanted to come and talk and present to the NINDS Extra Clinical Trial Group, and we were scheduling it, and John Marler said, who's coming? And I can't remember if it was Claudia said who it was, and then he said, where's their biostatistician? And she said, they don't have one, and he said, they can't come and talk to us. Seriously, right? I'm getting nods from the back of the rooms. I'm not making this up, even though you think I might be. So that was probably the most important thing, was about the biostatistician. So then I finished after 4 years of doing that, which was, like I said, it was like doing another fellowship. It was just amazing. I went back to WVU, and we got involved in some of the original NET trials through the courtesy of Cincinnati. We became a site for Cincinnati for some of the NET trials, which was pretty interesting. I became actually, so I didn't say I'm a neuromuscular person, I did say that, I can't remember, but I also became the stroke director when I came back. And I was vascular board certified and et cetera. And so we ran the SHINE trial, which was one of the most complicated trials I think I've ever been a part of, where you had to do IV insulin drip versus sub-Q insulin in the ICU and convince all the ICU nurses that they're not going to tell the patient what their glucose is. It was so complicated, and we were a small clinical trials group. I was really, really involved in that. But it was a great learning experience that you can actually do a clinical trial in the ICU, and you can get good data out of it if you monitor it closely. And then one came NeuroNext. So yeah, and how did I get involved in NeuroNext? It was just because I'd been networking with all these people, and Merit Sokovich, who's not here giving this talk right now, actually asked me if I was interested in doing site support. And one of the things that I learned from NET was that they had somebody who was in charge of site support, and I'm totally blocking out a name. Art Pancioli, right. And Art came to WVU and talked to me a lot, and and I thought it was so important that people felt connected. Like, we felt connected to Art. I knew I could pick up the phone and talk to him, and so that was sort of part of the design for NeuroNext. And Merit wanted somebody who would be separate from MGH, not be the CCC's spokesperson per se. And so asked me if I would do that. I said sure. I was also on, by then I think I got to be on the board of directors for the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, which has continued to give me a national view of what was going on. And so what did I learn during that phase? I learned that networking is still important, and it can lead to some really unique opportunities. Networking with Art really helped me understand a little bit more about how to do large trials. And you don't have to be the ultimate expert to lead a group. That if you listen and observe, sometimes what you can do is then move the group forward and help people not get stuck in the weeds, and that can sometimes be a very important role. You can partner across multiple disciplines, and it can lead to more success and interesting opportunities. And also learn that the institution you're in may not be able to support your dreams, and it's good to have projects that you can take with you. And then I went to the University of Iowa. And so at that point I had been told by my chair, so this is one of those sad stories, that I wanted to build our clinical trials unit bigger beyond stroke, and he said, we're not interested in that. Just keep doing what you're doing. And don't worry your pretty little head about that. No, I'm kidding. He didn't really say that, but he kind of said that. And so I went to Iowa, and I got involved with StrokeNet. I got involved with the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium. The CTMC kind of came along, and we started that. I got involved with the Iowa Neuroscience Institute, the Wellstone Muscular Dystrophy Research Center. In the middle of that picture is Kathy Matthews, who's been a former faculty of this group. More NeuroNext. We wrote an R01 to do a study in myotonic dystrophy to try to figure out natural history for that disease, which I had a long-standing interest in. And still, I was on the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology, because that's an 8-year stint. And then I got put on the residency review committee. So lots more about education and trying to understand how you can get research into the residency program. And that was a very interesting part of my career as well. So what did I learn? Natural history studies of slowly progressive rare diseases are very different than those for more rapidly progressive diseases. So I've been in a natural history study for ALS, and now I'm doing it in myotonic dystrophy and Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. And who was talking about CMT1B? Yeah, slow progression. It's very hard. So you have to figure out how you're going to find change. And then I also learned, I got a whole new education about neurogenetics that I'd never been exposed to. Really changed my life as far as how I look at diseases and how I take care of patients. The interdisciplinary collaboration, that importance just never fades, right? You just have to think about partnering is really how you move forward as a clinical researcher, and that every academic institution is different, and that resources can really help frame your project uniquely. So some things you can't do at one institution and you can do it in another. And a lot of it has to be understanding what the resources are that are there, that are available to you. And sometimes you can still do it at that institution, but you may need to reach outside of that. So then I went to Indiana University. All right, this is just like, that's our neuroscience center. It's totally cool. Let me just point this out to you. This is the clinical part. This is the basic science part. And we're connected, and it's one building, and it's way cool. And when I went there to visit the first time, I was like, I want to work here. This is really cool. And Bruce Lamb is the co-director of the Neuroscience Institute with me. He leads the basic science group, and this is the chair of neurosurgery. He's my partner in all of this. We have a mobile stroke unit, which is like, if you want to talk about cool trials, the mobile stroke unit trials were really cool and interesting and still go on. I continued to work in the CTMC, continued to work with NeuroNext, traveled the world with Dixie, visiting all the sites for NeuroNext. Dixie and Marianne Chase, who's not here, we decided after a while that we would try to figure out which site had the best ice cream. And it was Columbus, right? Ohio City. So still working with the NINDS common data elements, and then because of all of these connections and networking, I got asked to be co-chair of the steering committee for the Recover trials. And when they asked me, I said, are you sure about this? And they said, because I hadn't done any long COVID trials, but it has to do more with your...
Not many people had before.
Well, okay, no one had, all right, and no one has done too many, but I mean, it was kind of out of the blue, but it was sort of like, well, you've had all this experience and oversight, and we just need somebody to help move it forward. It goes back to my thing about not necessarily being the expert, but being able to listen and figure out what's important and how to move things forward. And so, what have I learned, and what am I learning? It's super hard to do research when you're the chair. Am I right, Dawn? You're right. Amen. Right. It's but still, the way I move forward is by doing interdisciplinary research. So you just keep partnering with other people, and all sorts of interesting projects come along. Always take advantage of new opportunities that come by, and then as you move farther in your career, you step back and you hand stuff off to other people, and then you just watch them go. Like I love giving people stuff and then getting out of their way and seeing them succeed. And at this point in my career, that's probably even more rewarding than anything else. And so it's been an interesting journey so far. You have to have curiosity, I think, is one of the things that has really helped me. Being persistent, then there's some serendipity, as I said, the accidental trialist, just kind of fall into some of these things. It's important to be willing to volunteer and keep an open mind. Networking is super important. Mentoring has become really an important part of my career so far, and I hope all of you find that you have good mentors who are just satisfied with seeing you succeed. And if you don't, start looking, because they're out there, and that's really how you move yourself forward, and your mentors will enjoy it as well. And I'll just say it's been a long, strange trip, but I'm willing to answer any questions. This is actually me, right? You have to choose your battles. I choose all of them. So, yeah. I'm no Merit Sokovich, but I can do better voices than she can.
To your...
Oh, that's French.
So I don't know if this is even like legitimate to ask questions, because I don't know. But you're welcome to ask me questions if you want. I might just make jokes, but.
I have a fun question for you.
Yeah.
What's the big in here?
Are you going to talk about SAEs?
Laurie is the only two-time SAE in history of clinical trials methodology course. No, my question is, if you had to pick a Star Wars character that best describes your career path, which one would you choose?
My career path? I would probably say, what?
And why for the rest of them that don't know Star Wars, I guess.
Oh, you don't know Star Wars.
Very sad point.
I thought we were gonna be
relationship.
I thought we were gonna be friends, Melissa.
I bought a TV, it'll be okay.
So probably for me, I still stick with like the old Star Wars more than anything else. So I always thought I was more Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is interesting because my son thinks he's more like Luke. Yeah, so Obi-Wan Kenobi, because I think he learned a lot, and part of it was, trying to mentor people and trying to see that there was good in him, in his mentee, which took him longer to figure out than it took Luke to figure out, right? So
Good one.
Who was your Darth Vader?
ALS is Darth Vader. Next question.
So when I started this job as the chair, like after 6 months in, and it was COVID, right, October 2020, I started, and my son said to me after 6 months, "So have you figured out who your arch nemesis is yet?" I was like, "What?" He's like, "Every leader has an arch nemesis. You have to figure out who that is." I
And
figured
slay
it out,
them.
but I'm not sharing it.
It's gotta be about servers.
No, it doesn't. No.
I'm trying to give it back.
Yeah, no, I don't think I can do a Star Wars themed question.
No Star Wars.
I can act out part of it. I do pretty good Princess Leia buttons, but other than that, I think one of the things you talked about was some of your early trials being negative. And I think in the early stage, there's a lot of, that's like a concern, a big challenge, and you try to lay out the trials with the hope that they won't be. But can you talk about sort of moving past that or growing from that?
Yeah, I think there's something to be learned every time you do a trial, right? That sounds like, advice maybe that your mom might have given you, or what did you learn from that, honey? But there is something to be learned, in each of those things that I talked about earlier. I kind of joked about, the lessons learned, these different things, but I did learn, many different things from those, including the failed trials. I think, or the negative trials. Did I just say failed trials again? I said it again. But I think the other thing is that sometimes you learn that your outcome measures aren't the right ones, right? And sometimes you learn that you're barking up the wrong tree, right? Like maybe what seems intuitive doesn't have enough preclinical data to support it. You just think you see it in the clinic and you see these people doing well, and so you think, okay, well, I want to try this and I'll do it in a more standardized fashion. And the preclinical work isn't there. You don't know if what you're doing is going to reach your target. All these kind of things that you've probably talked about in your small groups. But sometimes you can't get the preclinical data, and so you do, a study and you learn that maybe you're off base, and so there's always something to be learned from the negative trials. I don't know if somebody wants to give a smarter answer than that. Dietrich, you're laughing, so I'm going to ask you to give a smarter answer.
Choose wisely. The key distinction is a failed trial versus a negative trial.
Right.
It's a
Oh,
separate-
right. So that's a good point. Right. So a failed trial is one that is poorly designed, I think, is how I would think about it.
You mentioned preclinical. In neurology, it's difficult, right? We don't have that great models. For some we have, right? So at the end of the day, the proof is in the pudding, right? You have to do the experiment to get to the answer, and then better get to the answer, and then at the end of the day, you find out whether it worked or it didn't. And you want to learn from that.
Yeah.
I guess to riff on that sort of failed trial versus neutral trial thing a little bit more, I think a failed trial is a trial that you don't know what to do with the results. And like, knowing in advance that there are patterns of data that could emerge from your design that will leave you in that space is what we hope to avoid.
Yeah.
Underpowered, I think like a key thing is sort of underpowered efficacy trials, where you know in advance you're highly likely to fall into that space, where you might show like a point estimate that shows something promising, but a really wide confidence interval. And then, what do you do with that? You have to invest a ton of money in the next trial. So, anyway, Dr. Lewis.
He's gonna give a better answer. And he's not gonna ask a Star Wars question. I know that about Roger.
That you're absolutely right about. No, I don't have a better answer. I was just gonna say that when you're reviewing a manuscript, if the end of the conclusion say, therefore more work is needed, that's code for, I just tried to report a failed trial. So you want a trial that gives a clear answer, whether it's a yes or a no. And I think for the original question, if you design a trial that when it gives a no, it's a clear no, it's a major step forward in terms of what it frees up, in terms of people no longer pursuing a less promising avenue of investigation. It's just as valuable, and if it's presented properly from a career development point of view, I don't think it's a problem at all anymore. I think it used to be, but I think it really isn't anymore.
Yeah. That's an important point. Thanks, Roger.
So I want to build on something Roger just said, and that is, people ask, are funding agencies okay with negative trials? And I think the answer is yes, as long as no really means no, and you have something to learn from it. You all probably know when people do meta-analyses of studies, and they certainly do funnel plots and things like that. If everything is being reported as a yes, that means that we're missing some very important, potentially important data for the no's. And so I would encourage everyone, don't do the desk drawer thing where you just file away negative studies. It's the indeterminate ones where you have no idea what to do next or where things might have gone wrong. And hopefully that's going to come up more in the next couple of days as we're talking this through. But funding agencies are the major ones, and I'll speak for NINDS, even though I'm sure I'll have a disclaimer slide in a few days. But we are perfectly okay with negative studies as long as it is a well-designed, well-executed, scientifically sound no. And it's reported, yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say the point that Robin just made, which is that when you report a negative study, don't try to find little pieces of positivity that are probably just noise. Okay, I don't know, somebody is going around giving advice to junior faculty saying, you need to say something positive about. No, you don't. If it's no, it's just no. Don't try to spin it, and it will help you get into a higher impact journal if you just lay it out the way it is without any apparent affection for the treatment that's no longer worthy of investigation.
Dr. Lewis would like to report income from JAMA as a paid statistical reviewer. I mean, I don't think he wants to, but I just thought it'd be funny to tell you that. I mean, the other thing is, like, I was on the protocol review committee in Michigan when people were putting out COVID protocols, and literally, like, all of these individually investigator-initiated studies, they're like, I'm going to give vitamin, rolacex and come up with a letter, and have a 40% decrease in mortality. 100 patient studies. And I imagine if any of you reviewed these things at your own sites, you saw a bunch of things like that as well. And that sort of gets to this sort of like statistical lottery. Like, it's fine to do a trial that's neutral, but if I could have told you in advance that there's like the treatment effect that you're proposing, that bears no relation to anything that's ever been shown in a critical care trial, or other like in most trials, then that's a bad design. So I think neutral trials can be okay, but if they're couched within trials where you have an impossibly high effect size, that's not okay, I guess, to be simple.
Well, I think to expand on this, and I think Roger said this once years ago to me, that
Fiona, is this enough detail for an answer for you?
no, if you're designing a trial and you ask yourself, how can my trial fail? If it can't fail, it's a horrible design. It won't answer the question, right? Basically, you stack the odds in favor no matter what you see it goes. There has to be a clear way to know this trial succeeds, or that, not, I guess it's negative, not failed to the terminology. But if there's not a way you would meet like your no-go criteria, then it's probably not a good design.
Well, if you can't answer the question, it is a failed trial.
So Will, is your favorite character the Mandalorian?
It's too long a discussion for my favorite character. I mean, I kind of like angsty millennial, like Obi-Wan as well. Like, just kind of like, I have the high ground. Like, anyway.
I'm pretty sure Rogue One is now my favorite Star
I
Wars.
feel like a really common refrain I've heard you say, I've heard a lot of people say is don't do the kind of underpowered efficacy study and call it a phase 2 or.
Don't do the underpowered efficacy study, correct.
But in a lot of, but when we kind of think about the traditional phase 1, phase 2, you often think about surrogate endpoints or biomarkers, and kind of for phase 1, you're thinking about going from preclinical, and there's a lot of neurologic conditions where there's not very good biomarkers or surrogate endpoints, or there's not a lot of, preclinical work, or you're just repurposing something, so you don't need to do a phase 1 necessarily. What are some of the kind of types of designs or that you think about for, exploring a new idea, but really when you are looking at efficacy? And then not just making it an underpowered efficacy study and calling it a phase 2.
So like proof of concept plus.
So I have to talk to my chief medical officer in 12 minutes, which will save you. Okay. So, I mean, this is the subject of entire courses, but a few general things that come to mind. First, phase 2 is a horrible term because it takes a whole bunch of different necessary goals and steps in the development of a therapy and tries to pretend that it's one step or they're all the same, and they're just not. So there is early phase 2 work, early learn phase work, where you're trying to figure out dose, tolerability, interactions, metabolism, target engagement, all sorts of stuff that if you have a mechanism of action that you think you understand is critically important for figuring out whether that asset is worth betting on in a larger learn phase study, whatever you want to call it. There's late phase 2 work where the goal is not to pretend you're doing an efficacy study, but to figure out if you but to figure out whether you want to do a phase 3 study. So it's the clarity of goal that helps you figure out what the right design is, and all too often, certainly in some of the consulting work we do, we find that people, their goal is to do a phase 2 study, and they don't really know what they want to achieve with that. But a good late phase 2 study has as its result whether you should do phase 3 and how that phase 3 ought to be designed. That's not demonstrating efficacy, believe it or not. It's related to it, but there's so many other things that you need to learn from it. So that's an outline for a week's course.
All right, any other questions? All right, well, let's thank Dr. Gutmann.